Hello, everyone. I'm Kristen Hunter from EXL Events, and on behalf of EXL and the Avoca Group, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on employing strategies for effective risk and capability assessments when choosing a clinical vendor. As many of you know, EXL Events and the Avoca Group have an established partnership to work together and better provide the industry with valuable information. You'll find experts from Avoca presenting at many EXL events, including next week's second European Clinical Quality Oversight Forum in London and next month's Proactive GCP Compliance Conference in Philadelphia. There are just a few technical things I'd like to address before we get things started. So on your screen, you should see a menu bar at the bottom of your screen. Use the Q&A box to submit questions at any time during the webinar. Lisa McKay from the Avoca Group will be mining these questions, and there will be pauses throughout where they will be addressed. We'll do our best to get them all, but if your questions are not answered, please do follow up with me or the Avoca Group after the webinar, and we'll make sure to get you some answers. We also have several other boxes visible around the slides, providing you with access to relevant resources and events. All right, and now I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Dennis Salati, who is Vice President of Operations at the Avoca Group and Head of Avoca's Industry Research and Diligent Centralized RFI Platform divisions. He leads the strategy and execution of research projects for these divisions and Avoca's broader industry-leading research on quality, risk, innovation, and clinical trial execution. Dennis has more than 16 years in the pharma industry as a sponsor, provider, and consultant, and his experience spans preclinical research, clinical operations, data management, quality assurance, e-clinical, business operations, and strategic management. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dennis.
Thank you, Kristen. And thank you, everyone, for attending today. We've got a pretty aggressive agenda. There's four broad topics that I'd like to cover today in the hour. And we'll move quite quickly. So again, feel free to use that Q&A bar. And if we can't get the questions right, in line in the presentation, we'll pick them up on the back end. But the four things that I'd like to step through today, first, an exploration of kind of the strategies or an effective strategy for effective risk and capability assessments when doing your qualifications and selecting your clinical service providers. We'll talk a little bit about the critical factors to consider when engaging in those activities and that align with those strategies, and then what sorts of tools and processes in the qualification and selection business process that you can use to gather, some of the information that supports considering different elements of qualification and selection. And then we'll wrap up with a bit of a case study and a little bit about Avoca's experience in using a centralized approach. So taking different tools and processes and attempting to centralize them and put them and create a centralized resource to use in this business process, in the qualification and selection process. So that's a broad kind of ordinal ranking of what we're going to step through. I'm going to take it kind of linearly just by way of the slides, but just understand that as we go through these, we'll be referencing back to some of these different things as they're all interdependent upon each other. So before we get into the meat of it, I think Kristen did a great job introducing me and a bit of my background. My background primarily was with sponsor organizations and then later with provider organizations, as well as doing a bit of consulting. So I've kind of seen different perspectives of clinical outsourcing and clinical research. Avoca as a group has been focused in this area of clinical research and specifically within the clinical outsourcing domain for going on nearly 20 years now. So, in excess of my own tenure in the pharma space, and the organization originally started kind of in this center area, the green area of kind of research and advisory services, and again focused on this dynamic of within clinical research of clinical outsourcing and how we select, oversee, and work with our partners. Some of the things we're going to talk about later today touch upon some of the research that was the genesis for the development of the Avoca Quality Consortium. So one of Avoca's other business units, and the one on the left with the orange logo. And the Quality Consortium is essentially a pre-competitive collaborative, a group of like-minded companies across the value chain in pharma within the clinical space. So it's made up of sponsors of different size and genre, as well as providers, both CRO and non-CRO service providers in the clinical space. And what we really seek to do there is in a, again, pre-competitive and collaborative mode, solve some of the industry's challenges and capitalize on some of the opportunities that lie within the industry, one of which we're going to talk about today is really leveraging the qualification space and the selection and the vendor selection process to really optimize kind of the partners we choose to work with and how we work with them. Arising from some of the activities that came about through the Quality Consortium as a result of some of that research was the diligent qualification platform. And that's something we're going to talk about towards the back of the presentation. That's a centralized approach. So we'll bring that up towards the back of the presentation. But now that I've introduced a bit about Avoca and about the different areas of Avoca that kind of touch upon today's topic, I think what we'd like to do is have a couple of questions just to kind of have the audience introduce themselves in a way so we understand kind of who's in the room today and who we'll be speaking with, and tailor the presentation around that. So the first question, you can go ahead and read this while I read it aloud and make your selection. How many clinical service providers do you qualify annually? So the options there are 0. So perhaps you haven't engaged in this activity yet. It's something that's forthcoming. 1 to 10, 10 to 25, 25 to 50, or more, or 50 or more. So I'll give everyone just a moment to answer that, and then I will roll it forward to the results. So let's take a look. And don't forget to hit the submit button, actually, after you make your selection. Okay, so we see here there's a fair number that are in the 1 to 10 space, so qualifying 1 to 10 providers per year. And then kind of a bit of a distribution on either side of 10 to 25, and then at the extremes of 0 or 25 to 50. It seems like 50, or somewhere between 25 and 50 is the max. And that's we find that in our experience working with groups on vendor qualification and providing some advisory services around that, what we generally see is this sort of data is that it kind of maps to a couple things. It maps to the size of the organization and usually correlated with that, the size of the pipeline. So the number of assets in development and how diverse they are. And that can drive sometimes how many different providers and different qualifications as a result you need to generate. Okay, so that's the audience for today in terms of qualification activity. We're going to ask the next question is really around how you feel about how you would rate your organization's qualification process. So thinking about your company's qualification process as it stands today, do you feel it's strong, adequate, or perhaps needs work? So something below adequate. So again, pick one of those 3 selections. Don't forget to hit the submit button. I'll give you just a second there to make your selections. And now let's take a look. So fairly even distribution. It looks like the largest percentage adequate, and then secondary to that, those that needs work, and a smaller portion, nearly 20%, that really feel that it's strong today. And that very much maps with our experience, with what we see doing some work in both some research and some advisement in this area of clinical development. And we'll see some data in just a moment before we get into kind of the meat of the presentation that illustrates this a little bit more, put some color around this. But very good to see there's some folks that will benefit from what we covered today, whether you're a strong or you're at the other extreme of feeling like you need work with your system. So then the last question is somewhat philosophical, and I think is a nice segue into the material. So why do we qualify clinical service providers? And this is a little bit different. The other questions you could select, you had to select one response. I believe, I might be lying, so bear with me, but this is a select, you can select multiple options in this list. So the first option being because regulations specifically require it. The second one, because my company's internal SOPs require it, so a different type of compliance, right? Compliance with our own internal SOPs, because it helps make better selection decisions. And the final option, and this is fully anonymous, so don't be bashful if you want to select this. Come to think of it, I'm really not sure, which is a fair response. So give everyone just one moment. Again, I believe this is a multi-select, so if there's more than one that really maps to your thinking on why we qualify clinical service providers, please feel free to select it and hit submit. And we'll move
unfortunately,
forward
Dennis, it's not a multi-select, so we'll ask people to pick the best one.
Okay, no worries. So we see now when we look at the data, so the small, again, everyone had to kind of pick one, but it seems like the overwhelming majority is around helping make better selection decisions. And I think that's, if I had to pick the best response, I think that's an excellent one to select, because really, at the end of the day, while we do have to comply with regulations, we do have to comply with our own SOPs, really picking the best provider that's going to help us deliver our clinical trials, deliver medicines to patients. The bigger goal around this, I really think, is making better decisions. So excellent to see that. And I think we'll use that as a bit of a segue into some data that we surfaced when we asked some analogous questions around kind of why we do qualification. So one of the things that was really curious within my observation within the Avoca group is, as we've gotten into this area of qualification and vendor selection, concurrent with that, there seems to be an uptick in interest on our consulting practice around these sorts of elements. And one of the things that I think was the impetus for that was really the revisions to ICH. So we saw that there was some specific addendums, and here this is probably the one that I take most note around towards probably being a driving force to draw some attention to how we qualify and oversee our vendors. It's really one that speaks to our oversight responsibilities and how they extend beyond just our direct partners, but those that may be subcontracted by a CRO we employ. So I think this kind of made people sit up a bit and focus on some of their oversight practices, backing all the way up into how do we actually qualify and select a vendor, as that's kind of early in the pipeline of the whole outsourcing process. So thinking through kind of how we do that. This was echoed in some of the data. So Avoca does, as Kristen mentioned in my introduction, we do kind of an annual piece of thought leadership work, a piece of industry research. And this is available on our website. I don't have the URL, unfortunately, here, but all of our research is given away for free on our website, all of our industry research. So you can find the actual report there. But one of the things we asked about the report in 2017 was about what people were specifically doing in response to ICH. And a few of the things, bear with me while I animate through these, a few of the things that came up that touched upon oversight and vendor selection and doing capability and risk assessments, were things like focusing on risk management. So thinking about kind of our risk assessments and how we take risk-based approaches to everything, including our qualification and oversight of vendors. An increased focus on oversight itself, and then a bit of formalization of processes and tools. And what we see most commonly now, and this may, if you were in one of the buckets where you felt your system was, was perhaps one needing work, one of the common things that we find is that we know that there's a process occurring. We know that we're collecting evidence of qualification, we're doing qualification assessments, we're vetting our vendors, but sometimes that process isn't consistent throughout our organizations, or the process isn't consistent with how we're retaining and maintaining the documentation as evidence, so that when we have an inspection and we need to recreate the story of how we made our selection decision and qualified the vendor and how that has continuity through to our oversight plans, some of that documentation, perhaps isn't residing in a place that's easy to get to, or there's variability in what pieces of documentation are available. So we saw that come through in some of our research, around formalizing and aligning processes and tools. And I believe, again, the genesis of this was predominantly some of the revisions to ICH that kind of had folks stand up and take notice. But what we found is, there's probably other reasons. And when we think about kind of why do we qualify service providers, and we think about the data that we saw earlier just in today's group around really seeking to make the best decision, in some of the key relationship health indicators that Avoca has been tracking for many years through our research, we find that there are notable gaps, and there are gaps on things that that are kind of downstream service delivery measures that perhaps could be influenced by making better selection decisions, by having a more cohesive strategy around picking partners, and by selecting the right partners. So we see in some of this data there's gaps around quality, around overall work, around the value. And there's gaps in kind of the perceptions between the sponsors and providers, but more importantly, the sponsors themselves seem to have a very neutral stance. So beyond just the kind of the raw gap, there's a very neutral stance in terms of how satisfied we are with these different elements. And so when we think about the different components of partnering, the earliest step in the game really is understanding kind of, what are our needs and who are the providers that have those needs, and how do we really manage, how do we really make the best decisions around that? And this is something, just to give a bit of a historical view before we get into strategies to influence this towards the positive. This is a phenomenon that is not recent. While that data that I showed previously was from 2017, which is the most recent report, we've been tracking this over time, and we find that actually these gaps and some of the neutral sentiment around what we're getting in our outsourced relationships have persisted over time. And so, what this tells me, and what we'll talk about now in the remainder of the session, is really around how we can think about different strategies and different approaches to influence this, to really, kind of change direction a bit and try to, as one element of improving some of those measures, how we can make better decisions around selecting providers, as we all identified as kind of the purpose of our qualification activities. So I'll pause there for a moment. Lisa, if there's any pertinent questions that came through the Q&A, I want to pause here so that we could grab those. Otherwise, I'll jump right into the first of the topics for today around developing a strategy for an effective risk and capability assessment of our vendors.
Hi, Dennis. There are questions coming in, but I do believe that you will be covering them in a moment, so the next time you pause for questions, I'll bring them up.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you, and everyone keep sending those questions, because those that we don't cover, we will pick up either in the session today or as a follow-up. So I like to frame this section when we think about strategy. I think about I thought about war, about Sun Tzu and the art of war, and I apologize. In retrospect, I looked at this quote and I said, oh my God, this the last connotation, one connotation that I would never want anyone to take away from this is that that outsourcing or qualification should really be a battle. So if combat came to mind when you read this quote, when you thought about your qualification and your outsourcing activities, please do put something in the Q&A box, and we'll get someone to come help you, because it shouldn't be that way. But the focus of this quote is really when we think about I think about at the time going into engaging in a battle of some sort, right? It's the commitment of time and resources. It's recognizing that there are some elements that you can plan and control and some that you will not be able to. And it's one such that I found that when I think about outsourcing and I think about making the decision, taking the effort to identify and qualify and ultimately select a provider to do work with in clinical research, I see those same themes come out. I see that it's a commitment of time and resources. It's something that we can plan and we can do assessments to influence, but there will always be some unplanned activities that perhaps arise, and that the outcome can essentially be material, be significant. So picking the right provider, having the right partners on your clinical trial can really be a risk, a threat, or can be a true opportunity and enhancement and really drive success. So the other kind of nugget of information I think that comes out of here that ties directly towards having the strategy is taking an introspective view, and it's one that in my research and in the exploration that Avoca has done into this space is one that perhaps is kind of least top of mind with sponsors and CROs when they go out to do qualifications. Is this the idea of knowing yourself, knowing your organization's needs, and really thoroughly exploring that and understanding that before going out and doing kind of the external work. I think when we think about qualification, we think of it very much as going out and getting information about providers, right, and trying to make the decision. But it almost it begs the question why we don't first ask what our requirements are. And so that's where, as a strategy, the first really step in the process is is to do some internal analysis, do some planning, define your requirements. And again, I think about this often in terms of category of service. So what are, when we think about whether we're going out to find a data management provider or we're going out to find a biomarker lab, what are, if we talk to the business, what are the services or capabilities that we really want? What are the things that are going to drive the business forward? And we do that through stakeholder analysis and engagement. So go out and speak to people. Speak to the people in the business, speak to the people that will interface with the provider, thinking not only about today's needs, but about what lies 5 years ahead. Kind of what are, if we think about our pipelines, if we think about the assets in development, what are the capabilities? What are the, the specific the endpoints perhaps, or the technologies? What are the things that are going to really move the organization forward? So doing that, putting the effort in to do that sort of analysis. And then recognizing that there are other things outside of the business that I term more organizational requirements. So things like compliance with some of your procurement or legal needs, financial, quality requirements. A ready example of this, you can't work perhaps with a disbarred organization of some sort, right? So you have to check a debarred organization. So you have to check the debarment list. Those sorts of things are kind of enterprise requirements and constraints. So we have to recognize that. And then think, taking those pieces of information together, how do we want to approach this category and different pieces of it? And how do we, what's our overarching strategy? And when I sourcing strategy, and when I say that, it's, thinking about your organization and what your capabilities are, how the diversity and the volume of assets you have in development, what your needs are as they were communicated through the stakeholders, and what the requirements are as communicated by your organization from different areas. Does it make sense to go with a single provider? Is this a situation where you need perhaps a provider that can cover 80% of your needs that are, somewhat regular or common, and then perhaps you want to have a small cadre of very highly specialized providers that, that satisfy your niche needs? So you have to kind of think through what you're trying to achieve, and again, with a window of not just today, but the next several years out. And then understand kind of, okay, what do I want my portfolio of partners to look like? So again, very introspective, very thinking, very focused on what you need as an organization. And just to show kind of a quick model, so one of the things, how do we do this? We can readily access, external standards, and, we have RFI documents and things like that to go out and do the external view. But what kind of framework can you use internally to assess that? One of the ones, and there's several different iterations of this, but you can use this sort of framework where you step through kind of the regulatory needs, the assurance of supply or sustainability in the supply chain. So, are they going to be there? Do they have capacity? That sort of thing. Different quality and service measures, as well as innovation measures. So, are they, is there are they using emerging technologies? What are they? Are they your first call when you're thinking about new ideas, or when you need innovation and strategy in terms of your approach? So those sorts of things. So that's just one example. There are many available to step through, but the takeaway really is to do that in internal analysis. And then take it outside your organization. So the way when I teach a class at Drexel on outsourcing, and the way I try to frame that for people is, that's sort of, if you think about a SWOT, everyone is kind of aware of, kind of the SWOT analysis. SWOT, strengths and weaknesses, that's about introspection. When we think about threats and opportunities, that's the external organization, right? So that's who's out there in the marketplace, what kind of products, services, what are the capabilities, how do they map to those needs that I rigorously define internally within my organization? And what's happening, and what's changing, and that's where those kind of threats or opportunities can arise. Things to consider: the business landscape as a whole. Are we finding consolidation? As in life sciences right now, as we're often seeing lots of M&A activity, and or are we seeing sort of fragmentation or expansion in the area? So are there, who are the entrenched providers? Who's entering the landscape, and where are they coming through? The Amazons that are now entering kind of the pharmacy space and the healthcare space, is that sort of dynamic happening? So being aware of kind of what's going on in the space, and also, again, with everything sort of being e-clinical or technology enabled, kind of what's happening in the technology landscape. Is it a very stable area, or is it volatile and changing, as that may have influence over other elements such as regulatory and compliance concerns, as well as offer different opportunities around new capabilities perhaps that can solve some of your needs when you think about what your pipeline will look like today and down the road. And finally, the regulatory landscape. And this, I think, is punctuated probably by the E6R2, and then, probably more recently, we're seeing some things change within privacy law with GPDR. Is it a stable landscape, or is it changing? And, what level of certainty do we have in which the way things are going? So a lot of times, even when the regulations are effective, it's kind of wait and see mode to see what the enforcement actions are to understand really what's happening in that space and what we need to hedge in terms of our risks. So being aware of some of those external things. So just to recap kind of on this section, and then I'll pause again for questions in case there's anything specifically on this element of things. You really kind of step through, what is our sourcing approach? Are we multi-sourcing? Are we single sourcing? What is that portfolio of providers? And again, I like to think about this in terms of different categories of service. What is the optimal mix? What do I want in terms of large versus small, new versus kind of entrenched? Thinking about kind of that dynamic that's specific to your company and your company's needs. Looking at it from a portfolio perspective to understand where those different kind of risks and opportunities, where those are threats and opportunities where they can offset each other perhaps, and how you divvy up the work and how you utilize different providers. And then taking it through to understand what relationship structures, kind of align to that strategy. So, then do we need to seek preferred relationships? Do we want, more of a transactional approach, that sort of thing? So you can take it to that level of granularity as you progress in the process. So let me pause there. I know that was a lot. It'll get lighter, but the big strategic elements I think are a little bit heavier. Lisa, anything that came up around that section of the talk that I should address right now?
Yes, we do have a couple. So the first one is, what are sources of external landscape information?
Right, so when you're going out and trying to find who those providers are, so there are a couple different ways, and I'll answer this quickly, and then I think we'll move on because I'm just minding the clock. So one of the ways I like the best, right, is to walk down the hallways, go to a meeting, whether it's DIA or you go to the exhibit hall in a category-focused meeting, like a meeting specifically on labs or imaging or other sorts of endpoints, and walk through and really you can get a feel for kind of who the providers are in the space and make some face-to-face contact where that's practical. Sometimes the timing of that and the feasibility of that is not always there. The other area that I think, other than just some online research, one of the interesting things is kind of the centralization that we're going to get into at the back of the talk. So there are different areas where there's essentially having been created either something akin to a virtual marketplace or a centralized resource where provider capabilities and provider information. In the example we'll provide later, it's specifically around RFI information, where those are kind of all in one spot and can give you a very good running start towards kind of a feel for who's in the space. So those are just two top-of-mind ways to identify some of those providers. Networking is always another good way. I'm always a big fan of networking and speaking to your colleagues in the space through different industry groups, consortia and otherwise to find those. So let me move on, and we'll move a little bit quicker as I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I want to allow time for some further questions at the end once we've gone a little bit farther. So the next section really focused on kind of critical factors to think about. What do you take into consideration now when you've got kind of your provider set defined, right? And there's two quotes that kind of frame this, and I promise this is the end of quotes, but I thought these two were very pertinent. The one from Einstein, right? So, a problem with your life depended on it. A very critical problem, spending the first 55 minutes determining the right questions to ask. So this is really interesting, right? So it's, knowing what are the right questions. What are the, and this is something that when we did our research into qualification as early as 2013, we heard that there was quite a bit of pain around this, both within our consortium and across the industry, that especially in some of the more esoteric areas, some of the endpoint generating services, that there wasn't very good confidence in knowing that we were asking the right questions. So I think that's a critical element of it. The other one from Deming, you know, knowing how to ask the right question, the different element of it. It's kind of, you can know the right questions to ask, but then how do we go out and do that? We'll step through that. We're going to touch that one a little bit more in this section on tools, but I wanted to put that in context with kind of knowing the right questions and knowing how to ask them. So that, you know, I mentioned earlier the kind of the consortium and how the consortium played into this. So I want to step through a little bit about what the consortium is and how that played into qualification and some of the resources that are available through the consortium for member organizations, or, you know, those that are conceiving of membership. So this is a pre-competitive organization. It's a collaborative organization. We do thought leadership research, and as I mentioned, you know, as early as 2013, we started to surface data points that said that the industry was really struggling with qualification, with understanding the right questions to ask. And so we use this collaborative model as the engine to really answer that. And we do that through two vehicles. One, a little bit of further research. So we asked our members to share kind of what they do ask, you know, when they're collecting information and making a qualification and selection decision. And then we synthesize that all together into some leading practices and tools, and we'll show some examples of those in just a moment. But the idea around this is these were pain points within the industry and things that we hear today that organizations struggle with. And so we brought the collaborative together to really put all of the brains of all the 80+ companies together to solving this, to understand what are the right questions. So really using collective intelligence to determine kind of what are the industry standards around these, around qualifying different providers, and then later we'll see kind of developing mechanisms to do so. So just to give a quick visual for when I say 80+ organizations, what does that actually look like, who's participating? You can see the logos from the current 2018 members here, all different shapes and sizes, and importantly, all different stakeholders. So clinical service providers, CROs, and sponsors of all different size and shape. So it was the voices of that organization, of that kind of collaborative, that agency that came together that really said we wanted to fix this. And so we launched a project in the consortium to really first define what those standards are. What are the right criteria to consider? And so we did so by getting some expert input, bringing the intelligence from the consortium together and synthesizing that. That was from about 2014 all the way through 2015. We produced a bunch of tools and standards and things that I'll show examples of in a moment. And then later and more recently, took that into a centralized model, so a place where we could actually generate not just the templates and the standards, but actually you know, have some of the information from the providers readily available to kind of improve the process end to end, and you know, and help drive other elements of intelligence that can help make better decisions. So as an example of what that might look like, and now we'll get into a little bit deeper into kind of what are these considerations. So the place to start, and where we kind of started, is with the regulations, the guidances, those sorts of requirements. So while we collected materials from all of our sponsors, we went through a careful mapping exercise. And this is where, if you were to look for your organization on where to find what the right questions to answer when you're doing an evaluation of a vendor, it's spelled out in the regulations and guidance. So we could see here for electronic systems, which is an increasingly popular area given the technology enablement within the clinical space. Different examples here of Part 11 and ISO, things that kind of touch upon these. These sorts of elements, the way we've characterized them, we did so in a way that was very organized and traceable. And the reason why we do that is because what you want to do when you're creating an evaluation set for your clinical providers is really to understand what are your standards, what are your requirements, again, driven by that approach that I described earlier around internal analysis and then external analysis. When you're going out to actually evaluate the providers, you want to have traceability between what you have defined as a requirement or a standard and and then where that question is assessed, either through an RFI or through another assessment activity like an audit. and then kind of what the data, that you've collected around that tells you. So you want to have some traceability so you can understand, in a very clear manner, kind of how different providers stack up to your requirements. So we'll see how we organize that in a scorecard in a bit, but I think it's important to say that right at the beginning when you're just collecting requirements and defining what your standards are for your organization, that you do so in a very traceable way. So in our case, what we developed through the consortium is, to have an identifier, a bit of a descriptive identifier, so you knew, what that meant, and then the full description of the actual standard, and then we trace that out to where that standard came from. This is an important element because regulations do change, guidances change. We saw that with changes to privacy regulation and prior to that, changes to GCP. And so it's important to keep track of this because you need to monitor and maintain your standards in concert with, with updates that are happening from the regulatory bodies. That's a function that we provide through the consortium and through Diligent, but regardless of whether you utilize one of those approaches or a different one, it's an important element. And so I would recommend that that's captured, in your exercise of defining what your requirements are. So where to kind of look for some of these things, even when you're looking for things that are a bit esoteric, if you will. So whether you're looking at different endpoint-driven things, or perhaps IRT or interactive technologies. There are different reflection papers, guidance documents, things that are put out, even on the most technical topics from the regulatory bodies. So if you were to go out and do that work, to bring that into your organization to create, kind of what are the regulatory standards, these are the places to look, and they're all readily available. The other approach to take with this is to look for bodies that centralize some of this information, so different professional organizations. And that's essentially one of the things that we do through the consortium, was to consolidate that for our members so that it's available to them. Now, we took it a step further beyond just looking what was in the regulations. As I mentioned earlier, we employed our collaborative model to do this, and this is something, if you were to do it yourself, I'd recommend you replicate within your organization. We reached out to different companies within our consortium and had people that sat on advisory boards with dedicated interests towards these different areas to really go through and evaluate some of the standards that we had developed, the RFI documents, the different tools for doing qualification assessments. If I were to do this in an individual company, I think it's important to have different functional area representation as well as representation from different people within the business to make sure that you have a very thorough review and that you use as much collective intelligence within your organization as possible. Obviously, I advocate for an even broader view, outside of your own company's walls, but this is something you can consider just within your own organizations. We then took it outside of our consortium walls to talk to the actual providers of these services and have them conduct a review and provide feedback. That's something I think, when you're seeking knowledge, I think one of the ways you can leverage the provider base when you're trying to understand a space and what the right questions to ask is to engage the providers themselves. Most are readily accessible to provide you some guidance around, kind of what are the relevant standards, what are the relevant regulations. They can be a rich resource to point you in the right direction, for things. We engage them mostly to review our materials, but they are another source of information since they are dedicated experts in each space. So we'll pause there again. This is another section break, so I'll pause for questions. But just to recap kind of what we stepped through, I think the first thing is to really think about formulating an assessment that has continuity through your process, all the way through towards oversight. So really think about, when you're collecting requirements and you're thinking about all those factors, all those considerations specific to your organization and then perhaps germane just to the clinical space, doing so in a way that has traceability through to your RFI questionnaires, to your RFPs, to your scorecards or your evaluation system, all the way through to your oversight and performance management plans. So not every element that you use in qualification will be something you need to carry forward into oversight. But this is an efficient way to get your work done, is to really use that qualification, those qualification materials as a basis for what you then take into oversight. You can kind of pick and choose things that are relevant and bring those in and give yourself a head start on the oversight documentation and monitoring materials. The other thing that I think I'd recognize too, and this again, this goes to traceability and making sure you map to an industry, to the regulations, to the guidances, making sure that you know where your requirements are coming from, is that by doing so, you are able to then both align to things that may be influenced by externalities. So when there's changes to regulation, when there's changes in the marketplace, when something happens, you know exactly what you need to go back in and look at to address that change. So an example that was brought up by a sponsor I spoke to recently was, a CRO undergoing an M&A activity where they had actually worked with, both providers that had merged. They had to understand which SOPs the new organization was operating under in order to understand if they had any exposure. So let me pause there. Lisa, were there any questions that came in while I...
Sure, there are a couple questions, some related. I'll pose the first one and a follow-up one. So the first one is working with the full-service CROs in a study. Are they very good at qualifying technical service providers on behalf of the sponsors, and do they typically have robust vendor qualification processes that make it easier for a sponsor? And then a second one is kind of defining these criteria needed are easier when you focus on a niche activity. But what about the global providers? And there's very few number of them on the market.
Right. So I'll take the second one first. So the idea of kind of characterizing what are the requirements for global providers in much broader areas. I think that aligns typically to functions, right? To things like data management or clinical trial management or those sorts of functions. So while there are potentially less options in the marketplace, although I think for global providers, perhaps if we're just looking at the large segment, there are fewer. I think there's also a rich cadre of functional service providers of perhaps a smaller size that you could look at. But regardless of the number of providers in a given space, I think the important thing is to understand that the criteria by which you qualify them should not change. They should be appropriate, by context when we think about what we're doing with them. But there are, we think about the regulatory requirements, the quality requirements, some of the things that factor into the most important considerations. Those shouldn't change based on the market dynamics, based on whether there's one provider or 50 providers. That shouldn't influence really your assessment of, is this provider okay to do work with? It may provide a logistical challenge if you don't feel like there's enough options in the marketplace to choose from, or that there's not cost competition because it's there's not a very competitive market, if you will. But the criteria you're looking at when you're looking to qualify a provider, when you're looking to determine is it okay to do work with this person, should be in a way ignorant of kind of what the provider scape looks like. The only time I'd say that it really comes into consideration is when you're looking at kind of providers at the extreme. So if you're looking at a very large provider as opposed to maybe a startup in a very niche technical space, some of the infrastructure that you would expect in one versus the other will differ, and then you'll have to take that into context and evaluate that against your risk appetite, and what's appropriate for your organization. But aside from those kind of extreme considerations, I think you really have to try to maintain as much ignorance as possible to kind of the dynamics of the marketplace when you're really just defining what your qualification criteria are. So let me move on from there. I'm being mindful of the clock. We'll pick up, I know we had another question, but we'll try to pick that up at the back or perhaps offline if necessary. So I'd like to jump into this because this is where we really get to see kind of some of what these tools look like. So one of the images, and there's a great book on category management that I reference here that has this image. There's different segments, right, of the qualification process and the selection process. And so there's different tools. I won't step through them, but there's different tools that help you work through this kind of funnel of figuring out who ultimately you're going to work with. So it's important in each stage to use, I think, the right tool. From the way we've constructed it, from the quality consortium perspective, is really to first define those standards. So again, figure out what are the right questions to ask, what are the things we should hold the industry to, both across all providers, that's the kind of these core documents, and then in each different technical category that's represented here. And again, in a functional context, if you're looking at biostatistics or one of the other functions, in that specific context. So starting with the standards document and then really creating a robust RFI, or request for information, a place to really assess, the provider against kind of each one of these standards. So making sure, again, there's traceability and that you're asking the right questions that get you some information, that paint a picture of how that provider works, what their capabilities are, how their systems are set up. We've created a scorecard, so a way to take that RFI and then in a very customized way for your organization, for its risk appetite, for what the different requirements are and the relative value of the different requirements to the organization, kind of objectively assess when you're gathering kind of all different stakeholder feedback on the RFI response as a way to organize that. And then finally a visit checklist, so something different than an audit, not an audit plan per se, but a way that, again, is traceable back to the standards for when you go out on site and you're doing assessments or due diligence efforts, that you can make sure that you assess the evidence for the things that are most meaningful to you relative to the standards. So those are some kind of core tools that we would recommend. I'm going to go pretty quickly through this in the interest of time, but there are different, I call them RFX materials. So a lot of times one of the questions we get is the difference between an RFI and an RFP, or whether we can do one and not the other. RFIs are essentially focused on the provider. So this is really learning about provider. This is the external analysis specific to a provider. Tell me about what you do, what you're capable of doing, how you do it. Paint me a picture for who you are as a provider. When we get to RFPs and RFQs, the focus shifts a little bit. So now we're talking about a defined opportunity. We're talking about, help me understand why you are the right provider for this specific project. So it's the focus shifts a little bit more off the provider and their systems and processes and onto something more detailed around a specific project. And that's where we introduce kind of things around cost differentiation. So again, I believe these should be two separate steps in the process, as they serve a little bit of two different purposes in the qualification and selection scheme. This is an example of an RFI. Again, the traceability back to a specific standard, so you know what you're asking, but also the detailed questions categorized in different manners, for usability. And the important thing here, I think, is this comment box. Actually, it kind of seems funny. It's kind of an empty white box, but it's really understanding, beyond the yes/no check boxes, kind of what, describe to me kind of what's going on. So, if you your QA group assures that the activities are conducted in accordance with trial documentation, kind of describe to me how that happens. Again, the interest of this is to really paint a picture for how the capabilities of the provider in different capacities, in this case, their quality management system. We then take that forward to a scorecard. I'll show an example of that in just a moment. And one of the things to recognize around that is, in addition to kind of an objective way to kind of score the responses, if you will, or a way to kind of discern, which providers had responses that kind of elicited greater comfort amongst the team or greater confidence from the team. I think there's also, the opportunity there to have qualitative discussion among the stakeholders. So, so bring people together and really to discuss things. So there may be, the scorecards only take you so far, the quantitative only takes you so far. It's important to kind of have the tacit knowledge of our subject matter experts and our team members kind of come into the conversation. And then a determination of where to go next. So do we audit, do we need, what do we need to see evidence of to understand compliance with regulations? Are there things that we need for our due diligence efforts, so perhaps finances or other things that aren't amenable to be shared through an electronic means, things that we'd have to go, especially in the case of private companies, to look at on site. And then a determination of, do we need, based on our risk tolerance, do we audit this provider now before they do any work for us? Do we wait till they have assets in hand and then do we audit them? And how does that play into our overall, our risk management processes and our risk appetite as an organization? So that's probably a separate discussion, so I'll skip through that here. That's an example of the RFI scorecard and the visit checklist. I'm going to skip through these. I think these are all tools we've probably all seen. The important thing, if I could emphasize it again, is really the traceability back to your requirements and to the standards, asking the right questions. But I think, when we step through all this, one of the other pain points we heard in the research in 2013, and that we continue to hear as we do quite a bit more work in this area, is really, this is a lot of work, right? We feel buried by the number of qualifications we need to do sometimes, and getting them done in a time that suits our clinical teams, and how do we get through all of this work and really do it the right way? It almost doesn't seem feasible given our resource constraints. So Lisa, I'm going to hold questions just till the end. I want to do 2 or 3 more slides, and then in the last 5 minutes pick up some of the questions that you have collected. So, it occurs to me we see manifestations of standardization, centralization, optimization of different complex processes elsewhere. So there's other systems, pharma being, different areas of pharma perhaps, that have felt kind of some of the same pressure of, this is a lot of work. How do we simplify things? How do we standardize things? And I think CDISC is a great example. It's many different systems providing data, perhaps to a common location. How do we agree upon a common language for that? Well, we standardize, right? We come up with SDTM model, and we use that format, for our data. And so, standardizing as a way to react to some of those pressures. Outside of our industry, I think, we've seen that, I booked a flight for the EXL meeting in London recently, and, Kayak and other Expedia and other kind of information aggregators, and there's lots of different things, and you need to know who can provide what service when, and you need to know all of these options. There are services that exist to aggregate that information and centralize it. And then finally, and this is a bit around optimization, and I think where the industry's heading, especially more recently with a lot of the advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence and things like that, really understanding how we can take where we have aggregated standardized information, how can we take that into a bit of a decision support model? How do we leverage different, for a complex process, how do we understand the information better that helps us make decisions so that we're making decisions that remove some of our inherent biases and perhaps show us insights that we would not see otherwise if we had not used some of these more complex technologies. So at Avoca, we envisioned this kind of centralized approach, right? So this is kind of the system on the left that we saw, we see prevalent in the industry today, and really kind of redundant and a bit convoluted and and inefficient. And we see the opportunity to create a centralized process, an ideal qualification process where there's one place to put information, in a standardized manner where people can all pull from. As opposed to doing kind of this redundant model, to free up really the focus to the things that matter and the value-added activities, as opposed to kind of just the administrative type work of pushing questionnaires back and forth. So that was our mantra, this standardize, centralize, optimize. And again, we started with these sort of niche areas, the kind of technical services, if you will, as well as a broader base of requirements that satisfy all providers, regardless of what sort of service they're offering. And that was the first thing. That was what came out of the Prequalification Initiative. So I showed some of the tools earlier, where we've actually standardized what the industry requirements are, again, vetted through our quality consortium collaboration model, as well as the standard, created some tools and things that are traceable and that walk you through the process of making decisions and doing further evaluations of providers. We took that a step further with Diligent, where we actually centralized some of these activities. So we took all those standards and templates that came out of that. We invested in a bunch of legal infrastructure, so the contracts and agreements to be able to share information in this kind of new format that we conceived of. And then, our expertise in clinical outsourcing and the relationships we had with all the parties to that process. We brought that all into a pilot project, essentially, to see, can we do this? And it was a big, this was an experiment we did last year, and it was essentially a success. We ended up with over 50, or just near to 50 providers that participated in the platform with over 100 different RFIs across those service areas I described. So these are the participating providers. And we had the participation of 13 different sponsors. So these are sponsors that utilize this idea of the centralized infrastructure that we've created, and through that they received over 150 RFIs through that process. So we decided that was a success and that it is indeed possible. There's some recent news in outsourcing pharma, and I'll be speaking about this in London next week a bit further around centralizing these activities. But we feel that we've proven that the opportunity lies there, and now we're taking this to the next level where we're expanding into some of I think where the question was earlier around global services. We've expanded that into clinical monitoring, data management, medical writing, biostatistics, different areas. So we're moving into those global services to see if this model can further add value and support that, as well as bringing it into now a kind of a fit-for-purpose technology. So something that's improves the user experience, if you will. So that's just a bit about what we've been doing, and kind of brings you up to speed with with the industry in terms of centralized resources and approaches. Just to recap, commit to a very rigorous introspective evaluation. So do a requirements exercise, commit yourselves to that, and then apprise yourselves of the external conditions. So look for threats and opportunities within the marketplace. Kind of seek out and leverage, the industry standards, the industry accepted standards, when you're doing your qualifications, and we step through a few different sources of those. And then as you get through this, if you encounter constraints around this, really take a look at, kind of different models for centralized approaches to reduce your resource burden, kind of hit your timelines, and drive higher quality. That's kind of the takeaways from today's talk. I think we have a minute or two left, and I apologize, that was probably lightning speed towards the end. But Lisa, do we have questions I could pick up now in these final few minutes?
We have a lot of questions, so I want to remind everyone that we will, you can contact Avoca and we'll follow up. So I'll just pick up a couple of them. So one of the things that was interesting from earlier in the conversation was, regarding enforcement, how deep is the dive by inspectors? So, for example, in a country-specific drug destruction provider, are they going to apply different processes compared to CRO qualification, selection, and oversight?
I think it's a very good question. It's a very specific question, but it hits upon a kind of a broader topic, right? And I think it's kind of, what activities are we doing today in terms of that we're doing or our CROs are doing on our behalf in terms of qualifying, specific types of providers, and then how well does that map to what we expect to see or what we will see in terms of enforcement action? And I think this is one of the kind of the chicken and egg problems within the industry, is that we really, while we make inference into what the regulations and guidance means, right? We interpret things a certain way. We have to. They can't be perfectly prescriptive. They don't tell us actually how to do a lot of things. They just tell us what the expected outcomes would be or what we need to shoot for. In that case, I think that's a perfect example of staying attuned to what's going on within the industry and focusing on that external analysis. So looking to see what the enforcement actions are, and I think we get some metrics periodically throughout through the regulatory bodies. It's another opportunity, I think, if you belong to different industry groups, in consortia, different, even some of the publicly available chat rooms, things like LinkedIn, to really look at kind of what and get some ground level truth for what people are experiencing. One of the ways we've tackled that, not in that specific context, in the consortium, we have an inspection experiences initiative where for inspections more broadly, but across all the different agencies, we collect member experiences anonymously, and then we act as sort of a clearinghouse, and we publish them back kind of in a de-identified way, if you will, to bring that sort of insight back to our members. there are other, manifestations of that, I think, in different industry groups, and perhaps one that is specific to drug, drug supply management, and specifically IP destruction and things like that, IMP destruction. So I think it's a great point and something that kind of underlines why we need to keep attuned to those things. So I think it looks like we have a few more minutes, if folks can hang on. I know, those on the West Coast, their stomachs are probably growling. Those on the East Coast, are, where I sit, might be in the postprandial thing. But let's take another minute or two. Lisa, another maybe one or two questions if we have them, especially if there's quick ones.
Sure, there are lots of great questions. The next one is, in my experience, sponsors do not do a good job of capturing historical data. For example, actual past experience with a specific vendor, and for a variety of reasons, lack of time, legal considerations, etc. So what suggestions do you have regarding past experience to inform decision-making for vetting vendors for use in the future?
I think I love that we've got a provider voice in the mix, and I think that's an excellent point, right? So we saw at the beginning of the talk, right, when we as a group, we kind of voted on why do we qualify, providers, whether, and the resounding answer was, to make better decisions. I think past experience with a provider is an excellent piece of intelligence and data to help make better decisions, right? Not only because it can tell you, with a specific provider, what the experience was, but it can also help you diagnose some root cause, and it can help you in that introspective analysis. How did this, why was this experience, so not as optimal as it could have been? And oftentimes, what we found in outsourcing relationships, it's not a singular party, failure. It's oftentimes there's things we both could have done better. So I think it has value on both sides of that equation. The simplest answer would be to say, well, to retain that history in some capacity. Gather your experience and provide that, and I think and store that information. I think the trouble is there's no within sponsor companies, often there is a limit of time, and there's no one probably prompting to capture it, and there may be a lack of infrastructure. I think where we see more centralized models exist, as we start to see this idea of centralizing information and leveraging shared resources in pre-competitive areas, I think we may see that capturing that experience becomes easier, and it's almost prompted perhaps by some of these pieces of infrastructure. Initially, I expect it's going to be at a very, at a sponsor level, so it's not information that we would share outside of our walls. It would be our own individual experience, and we would keep that. But there are things that come out of that perhaps if shared with a provider, and Avoca does quite a bit of this in our bespoke practice, where people do client satisfaction surveys, and they want to hear, constructive feedback and where things didn't go right so that they can improve. I think, we can start to see that being a vehicle to help both sides drive greater success in their endeavors. Okay. I think, Chris, we have one more maybe.
Okay. How about a fairly broad one? How often are qualifications in the centralized model updated? For example, every 24 months? How is that done?
Okay, so I can only speak to Avoca's experience on this. So don't extrapolate this beyond, to other potential centralized sources. But with our experience, when we went in to it, we thought, perhaps biannually, I think is what we put out on the table, and we got a very resounding body of feedback from the provider space that said that quarterly would be more appropriate. Things change, and that's kind of the cadence at minimum that would be appropriate. And again, more volatile spaces of clinical development, probably evolve technologies and capabilities even more frequently. What happened in practice was actually kind of surprising. So, or perhaps not so much in retrospect, but we have a request and approval process. So our model is that while the information is centralized, the provider maintains autonomy over the release of the information. So they get notified of a request, and then they have the ability to approve that request, and then upon approval, we can issue the material. that actually served as a trigger where providers, prior to providing approval and saying, okay, go ahead and send the information, they would actually say, well, I'm going to look at it real quick. And they would spend a bit of time, a very short bit of time, looking at it, knowing that there might have been a few elements, a select few elements that have changed. So if we're on to a new quarter, perhaps a new org chart is available, or if they update an SOP, the table of contents has changed, or something to that effect. And so, in essence, we started to see that it was, I don't want to say in real time, but almost upon request. So at the point that any sponsor received the information, it was actually as up to date as the date of their request where the provider responded to it. I think as we start to see kind of more, the infrastructure around centralized resources get a bit more mature, I think we'll actually start to see that be a resource for providers to different, a resource for them to maintain their RFI information. And in that case, I think, even that small window of, I want to update a few things before I hit send, I think we'll see shrink even more. So I feel like we're about 5 minutes over, and I want to respect EXL, and the attendees on the call. So I think maybe this might be a good time to wrap up, and then we can pick up some of the questions that have come in offline and get your responses. Does that sound right, Kristen?
Yeah, no, I think that's
great.
A great idea. We did have a lot of questions coming kind of late in the game, but as you said, we definitely will be reaching out to everyone to make sure that those questions get answered. So I want to thank you so much, Dennis. That was great. And to everyone who was in attendance. We will be emailing you the recorded version of the webinar as well as the PDF of the slides. That email will be sent out tomorrow, so look for that. Also included in tomorrow's email will be exclusive discounts for webinar participants on several of our upcoming events, including next month's Proactive GCP Compliance Conference on March 19th to 21st in Philadelphia. So thank you again, Dennis and Lisa of the Avoca Group, and to all of you for participating. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.